Last time we were talking about the path of method and how various methods or techniques are used, such as breath control and binding the winds in the central binding the winds so that they'll enter the central channel, thereby inducing the subtle minds. Stopping the coarse conceptions, finally, and inducing the subtle minds, finally, inducing the fundamental innate mind of clear light. Then, the all-creating monarch is referring to the path of release. When it says this is the vehicle devoid of exertion. So we get the contrast with the path of method. Now, in my reading this morning, I just kept reading, and didn't even, it was so fascinating, and didn't even get to the end of this chapter. And what I have in the back of my mind is to map out the movements that take place in this chapter. Mipam Gyatsho, I would even say lovingly, launches into a description of the path of method. Obviously, seeking to describe the path of method in a very intimate way, intimate and friendly way, in accordance with such tantras as the Guhya Samaja Tantra, and to show how it is practiced in the Nyingma tradition, and I would say also in the great completeness tradition, if we take great completeness in its broader meaning. Then he moves into describing the great completeness tradition in the narrower sense of the path of release. And then he moves into describing how the path of release in the great completeness tradition should not be described in terms of subtle minds, the subtle minds of the minds of the white, red, and black subtle minds, and probably also, not probably also, and also the fundamental innate mind of clear light as it would be described, for instance, I would add, in such traditions as Gelug. The section in which I say he lovingly and most friendly describes the path of method is not described as it would be in such traditions as Gelug, but is described from the point of view of Nyingma. And I would say Nyingma, great completeness in its broader meaning, and how it actually is practiced that way. It's later in this chapter that he points out the flaws of how it is practiced, it is described in such traditions as Gelug, and how those descriptions should not be used in the description of the great completeness in Nyingma. I would say, not only for the path of release, which is his particular concern here, but also should not be brought over, I would add, for the description of the path of method in Nyingma. And as I am seeing it, in the broader meaning of the Nyingma path of the great completeness, in its description of the path of method. So these are the movements in this remaining section of this chapter, which is chapter 3, right? Some people, I think, are willing to think of the great completeness as only in terms of the path of release. And I'm pointing this out now so that I hope I'm advocating. I'm opening the way for seeing that the way that Mipam Gyatsho, and we'll soon see it, describes the path of method, the way he describes it so full-throatedly, it's not a description of something he disagrees with, or, well, well, let's put it this way. I suggest looking for clues that it's fully accepted within a broader context of the great completeness. I just put that forward as something to look at as you read through that section or movement. You say, I'm thinking of symphony. So anyway, in this lead-in, there's in the all-creating monarch, we're starting with a prelude, I guess, of section on the path of release within the great completeness. Appearances of cyclic existence and nirvana are arrayed as self-dawnings. Some would translate this as natural dawnings, and you can see why. Self-dawnings may be appearing to be, a mysterious word, natural dawnings. But, dawnings by themselves, they just appear in and of themselves. You see, not having to make exertion. From the noumenon of the mind. Now you see, this word mind is used even if when we make a difference, when we Nyingmas make a difference between mind and intrinsic awareness, Sem and Rikpa, then mind is lower, but then the word mind is used without this distinction between mind and intrinsic awareness. So you have to be on the watch for when the distinction is made and when it isn't made. So noumenon of the mind doesn't mean crappy mind. The foundational primordial mode of abiding. But in terms of the mode of abiding, all whatsoever appearances are primordially wheels. It just says Korlo. I mean, does one want to turn that into Ginkor, Mandala? Wheels of exalted body. Whatsoever appearances. So it seems that appearances here are limited to physical appearances. Appearances of bodies and forms here being what? Colors and shapes? As opposed, the word forms includes sounds. If you did this. What does appearances mean? Appearances could include sounds, but obviously in the next list, reverberations then refers to sounds. So appearances then is more limited. So then any exalted body. So then the wood in your room and the formica tables will just be appearances, say, of Vajrasattva. A whole lot of Vajrasattvas. And as you know from Gelug practices and so forth, one just sees appearances of Vajrasattva or various female and male deities, or whatever. Just a whole lot of them. Everywhere. Even in these shapes. But you don't see books and so forth, and bookcases and formica tables and shades and doors and so forth. But things in those shapes and walls, and, you can keep these same shapes, but just a whole lot of deity bodies. Okay, and Donald Trump bodies, you don't feel to laugh or be disgusted, or, So you see a whole lot of little Vajrasattva bodies or Manjushri bodies, or, and reverberations, whatever sounds made, There's some particularly ugly bodies, sounds, when you go to the city, and all you hear are mantras. It's pretty difficult, isn't it? I never try never to listen to any commercials. If I have the TV on to a program, I record everything and then just jump over the commercials. So I think it's a bastardization of language. I'm so offended by it. So, what's wrong with me? I should be hearing, Omara Bhajanati, 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 Omara, I should be able to turn that on during the commercials. And then if I want to hear the program, it's pretty obvious when the program comes back on, if that's so important. Or if it just went on like that, and the program was replaced by a whole lot of deity bodies, that would be pretty nice, huh? Or, turn it on and off. I particularly difficult, I'm so, prejudiced. Primordially wheels, what does wheels mean? A whole lot of exalted speech. And memories and conceptions are wheels of exalted mind. Lectures or sutras or tantras, or, given that I don't have any of them memorized, I don't even have the Heart Sutra memorized, pathetic person that I am, I just gave up on it. I was so fed up sitting at ceremonies for 5 years at the monastery in New Jersey that, Geshe Wangyal for some reason had us I guess I'm the only one that lasted at that particular juncture for 5 years. Just sit there. But of course it caused me to abstract my mind, blah, blah, blah. The teacher three bodies are arisen from the mind of enlightenment. And then Khetsun Sangpo goes on to explain what they are. Then Longchen Rabchan's Treasury of the Element of Attributes. And when you read enough of the third wheel of Dharma and of Tantras and so forth, you begin understanding why it is, why the Dharmata is the element of attributes. It spews forth attributes as self-dawnings in accordance with the meaning of the thought, of that Tantra. In other words, in the treasury, it's stated there in accordance with the meaning of the all-creating monarch. In other words, that's his source. So, there are not any proliferations in such a noumenon of the mind. The naturally luminous self arisen pristine wisdom. Hence, the conventions of dualistic phenomena such as newly arising or not. You're used to it by now, right? And so forth. Do not exist in it. Mind, sem, exists in the dualistic manner of realizing and not realizing. That's what now we get. Mind is crud. Therefore, the noumenon of the mind is the primordially abiding suchness. Well, actually, noumenon of the mind is, I'll have to take a slap across the face. Mind there is being taken as crud. Is the primordially abiding suchness to be realized by the path. Now we're getting the differentiation. I've read all this, but I guess I read too much. I just went on and on and on reading. This stuff is brilliantly set forth. His secretary was fantastic. His literary ghost. And the agent realizing it is awareness. Lo. That is to say, the wisdoms of hearing, thinking, and meditating. You see, these are all affirmed now. In other words, sem is crud, but look at what it does. It's realizing. The agent realizing it is awareness. What is, and that's crud in one sense, but it's the wisdoms of hearing, thinking, and meditating, which are mentality, yeet. And then Khetsun Sangpo says before, what is that? That's the mental consciousness. During occasions when the conceptuality of listening and so forth has not stopped. In other words, that's needed at some point. It may be crud, but it's needed at some point. So there are points when it's needed, but you've got to get beyond it. So, it's path, and we need path, but we don't just need path. There's a deeper state before path, there's a deeper state after path. And then notice, and Mipam Gyatsho says the same thing, the Dalai Lama says the same thing in the book. What's the book called? I'm making money now, like 5 cents for each book. So I have to get you to repeat the title. The Heart of Meditation. The Heart of Meditation. Yeah, we've got to get that in. And if I'm clever at selling it, I get somebody else to say the title. These guys on the internet selling their stuff, jeez. So, his last part of it, due to the fact that our minds are obstructed, to the extent that these adventitious obstructions are purified, our realization of the noumenon improves. Thus, there are levels of improvement. Unless you undergo simultaneous enlightenment. Simultaneous has been translated, for decades now as sudden enlightenment coming through East Asia, which is good. It's sudden, it takes place, quickly, suddenly. Simultaneous coming through the Tibetan Chikchawa, simultaneous in that levels of the path are passed through So, Khetsun says, when mentality, that is to say the mental consciousness, identifies the natural entity. Now this word entity, at one point later on I say the face, and it comes, translations from East Asian Buddhism come through as face. I think face is good, because we identify people often and ourselves often, from our own point of view, as face. You know, as long as you add a mirror, you know what your face is. You know, and if you're looking in a picture, you look for your face, usually. Not always. And when your basic entity, your basic, even self, and that's even used in the perfection vehicle, when your basic self manifests, you know it. It's like identifying your own face. Your own real face. Oh, that's it. Even that's what I am, which wipes out all of this other identification. It no longer involves different apprehended object and apprehending subject. You see, Gelug is still willing to use the language of apprehended object and apprehending subject, even though Langdon, you know, over and over. See somehow out of the picture? Even though he over and over talked about, in terms of experience, it's like fresh water being poured into fresh water. But Gelugpa uses the conceptual language even of apprehended object and apprehending subject. Whereas in Nyingma, that's totally forbidden. Totally forbidden. Why? Because they want that language to be utterly dropped out. So the fact that Gelug keeps using this language deceives some people into thinking, even in direct perception of emptiness, there is the sense of apprehended object and apprehending subject, whereas there just plain isn't in Gelug. There isn't. It's water and water. That's said over and over again. But when they use conceptual language, they're willing to still use that. That doesn't mean that it is experienced that way. It's said that the way it is experienced is inexpressible in language. But then, when they express it in language, they're willing to use that language, not because it feels that way. So a different linguistic system is being used. And then you have to see what happens when you use that language, And those words, linguistic system, forget about using words like linguistic system or even that language, you just say those words. It loads it up too much with, it's a real relief, as Khetsun Sangpo said, apprehended object, apprehending subject are bad. Sungzin dukjare. apprehended object, apprehended subject are bad. Apprehended and apprehender are bad. Sungzin dukjare. Dukja means bad. It's common language, bad. You're bad. It's very refreshing. In English, more would be subject and object are bad. It's very refreshing. So it's good to have one system that says subject and object are bad, and another system that uses those terms. They're really helpful. Yeah.
Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Jeffrey, so just to clarify, bad when applied to discussion of the experience, right?
Well, when applied to, in Gelug, even, you could say that, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
good.
Okay.
But
Okay, thanks.
Khetsun is carrying the message. Just plain drop it when you're talking about meditation, deeper stages of meditation. But even okay. That's true even. You can make that qualification. Yeah. Good. In other words, I could reframe your question. Wouldn't that qualification be true within Nyingma? Yeah. I might, see, I made a little qualification when I did. Yeah. So, object and subject become, and
words to say something.
excuse me?
Say words are bad. And what's interesting is we're using a whole lot of words to say that all this language and words are bad.
Right. So that means go to the forest. As His Holiness said when I asked him for a letter for a group in Germany that wanted to build a temple for a Gelugpa monastery, he said, no! They can go to the forest and meditate. This was in our first person-to-person meeting. And later he relented, but then I refused to ask him for it. It is said that there is a jewel that causes everything seen to appear golden. Like this, when the inconceivable noumenon manifests, all factors of conceptuality vanish, turning into the noumenon itself. So you see, at that point, you can't quibble that, you see, when the noumenon manifests, there isn't going to be any conceptuality left over. Everything's going to be gold. Khetsun on other occasions has said, if you go to a land, let's say another planet, where the land is just gold, you're not going to find any dirt. So back to Mipam Gyatsho. You should understand that although the conventions of realizing and not realizing do not exist in the foundational noumenon, these conventions of realizing and not realizing are due to the impact of sentient beings' awareness dawning from within the context of the noumenon. So I'm reading Khetsun Sangpo to see if there's anything we need to read out loud. Last sentence. When you recognize these appearances as appearances of the basis dawning from this basis, you are released. It's powerful stuff. Concerning this, when by means of the path of release. So now we've been in, right, this section on the, shall we call it, the narrower great completeness. When you recognize these appearances as appearances of the blah, 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 when by means of the path of release you are introduced to and identify the noumenal foundational clear light or mode of abiding, you sustain its continuum, whereby familiarization gels. You see, these are the first two of the three keys in, what was the name of that famous book again? Yeah. In other words, the first key, which I couldn't remember when I was television interviewed in Taiwan. The first key is to be introduced and identified. That's one word in Tibetan. By a lama or a teacher, be introduced to by the lama and identified. In other words, you might be introduced in a sense, but you couldn't get, if you don't identify it, if you don't get the introduction. So introduce and identify this noumenon. And the second is to sustain that continuum. And the third, which if you read that book, you'll notice that His Holiness pulls the third into the second, which is, there are various modes of conceptuality dissolving, conceptuality appearing and disappearing. And it's hard to sustain, to do the second without the third. And I say that's why he introduces, he doesn't say he's introducing or bringing the third into the second. And that always confused me. What's going on here? It seems as if the third is coming in to the second. And then he goes on to explain within the third there are three different ways of rang sha, rang tro, Rang Shar means itself dawning, conceptuality dawning, and it's self-releasing. There are three ways of its release. And how could you sustain the continuum? The second one, you see here? You see the three, the introduction, and the sustain its continuum, the continuum of this identification. The second one, how can you sustain its continuum without gaining some ground on when conceptuality dawns, not being yanked along by it, dragged along, dragged into, oh, that's fascinating, I'm going to go along with that. Oh, how is it that we get pulled along by the stream and end up down the stream of, oh, that's so, oh yeah, oh yeah, I'll go, if I don't go along with that now, I've got to, it's like, oh yeah, oh yeah, I was going to meditate on, even you think it, oh, I was going to meditate on, oh yeah, what's that, oh, what was I doing? Oh yeah, I was going to meditate on it. Oh, what's that? Impermanent. Oh yeah, but there is a better way to plow the driveway. Oh yeah, if I plowed the snow up over there. Oh yeah, but yeah, oh yeah. Oh, and there was that thing in the store. Oh yeah, we ought to buy more of this and pack it away, because as we know now, we're running out of rice. And if we had 400 pounds of rice instead of 200, if it snowed even more, oh, time's up, isn't it? What was I meditating on? Oh, well, who gives a shit anyway? I figured out how to get more rice. And there was that other store. Oh yeah, Costco. If we drove a couple hundred miles, we could go to, oh yeah, but maybe they didn't plow that road.
Starting to sound like they're more children. Their stories.
Actually, I just thought of a good one. If we keep following these, eventually we end up like Trump, who really, you turn into a child, and you're totally hopeless. Just, in your old age, you got no hope. And don't think it's because we're old, we're already there. He's at a different level of this. It's like a ball floating down a stream, and the ball likes where it ends up. Right? Oh yeah, I ought to think about that. Yeah. So when you recognize, what is this? As appearances of the basis storing from within the space, you are released. But even if you're not released, you're back on your topic. Whereby familiarization gels. It's just like cultivating calm abiding, right? Whereby familiarization gels. King Sangpo says, this is what is called meditation. Basic meditation. Through meditation, you attain stability with respect to the foundational clear light. In this case, right, He's applying it to what you've been introduced to. As he used to say to me over and over again, Tempatan Sheishin Lamki Gongki Lamki Gongki Lando. Oh! Gongki Lando. Mindfulness and introspection are the basis of the path. And this is basic meditation. In this case, basic meditation is being applied to what people keep calling it pointing out meditation, but what you're introduced to and identified is the pointing out that's done in, what you're asking me to, come and teach. And I think somebody like Dan is good for it. Which is the Samantabhadra of foundation. Which is the Samantabhadra of the foundational mode of abiding. At that time, the consciousnesses of the 5 doors of the senses dissolve into mentality. This is all one sentence. Like what happens when you fall asleep, the 5 sense consciousnesses, eye, ear, nose, tongue. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body consciousnesses cease. Because you're paying attention to something deep. Or, you pay attention to whatever it is your mental consciousness is meditating on, due to which conceptuality cannot involve itself much, he's very careful, in external objects. If somebody bangs something, drops something in the kitchen, there's a little bit going on, so you'll hear it. Mentality dissolves into the mind basis of all. This is, another system, which dissolves into the basis of all, the little different layout of the 8 consciousnesses, even 9, which dissolves into the foundational, noumenal, clear light emptiness. What time is it? Huh? At this point, the consciousnesses of the 8 collections have been entirely reversed and are non-existent. So we should stop there. See you then.